Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got one of these little 1/16 scale trucks everybody seems to be playing with. This is the WPL Toys military truck, also sold as a Heng Long with an arguably better box. Either way, what you get inside is the same. On the bottom of the box we have the usual bits of information. It's all fairly rudimentary, coming from hobby grade RC, and to be honest, we're only really interested in the chassis and body. The front of the box has a pull-away section for shop display, and it wouldn't surprise me if a couple of the traders at next year's shows don't have a stack of them in stock. From China you can pick them up for as little as 20 quid if you don't mind waiting, 30 quid for instant shipping, and if you're impatient they're around 40 quid from a UK based shop. In the box we get the instruction sheet. It tells you all about charging the included battery and installing the batteries in the transmitter. It's a toy grade model, so there's really not a lot to it. The transmitter's a little bit small, but it does have a proportional throttle, which is nice, but the steering operates two buttons when you turn it. I'm guessing it functions, but it's not going to be all that good to use. Then we've got the USB charger. A nice thought, but I don't think I'm going to be plugging a device of unknown quality into a computer or any other USB source anytime soon. We're going to be better off cutting the leads off for the battery connector and using a proper hobby charger. There's a spare pair of leaf springs stuck down with some tape, an interesting addition to the kit, and I'm sure someday they might come in quite handy. Which just leaves the truck itself. It's 1/16 scale, so it should be the right scale to run with the Heng Long and Tamiya tanks. The body's surprisingly detailed, which is the main reason so many are tinkering with the model. Some of the builds really would pass for an expensive custom scale model. There's a basic but detailed interior. It's hard to catch on video, but there's actually a full set of gauges moulded into the dashboard. Underneath we've got a central gearbox with plastic drive shafts going out to the axles. There's no bearings at all, not even bushings, and I've heard the drive shafts aren't the strongest. But just remember how cheap it is. When they designed it, they did have a good think about the battery tray. They could have stuck it under the bed somewhere, but instead they made the bonnet openable. It's only a 5-cell 700 mAh NiCad, but I'm sure it's just about good enough to get the truck moving. The transmitter needs a pair of AA cells and has the usual little screw to keep the cover in place to stop little kids from getting at them. With the batteries in we can turn it on, and the red light blinks, I assume, waiting for the truck to get turned on too. Under the bonnet the battery can be plugged in, and at the front of the chassis we can turn on the red switch. And we've got headlights, so I assume it's powered up okay. Pulling the trigger does indeed move the truck forward and back with proportional control. The steering, however, kind of works, but it's not great. It'll be one of the ones where the steering control turns on a motor that pushes against a centering spring through a simple centrifugal clutch and gearbox. Other than a solenoid, it's about as basic as it gets. Right, that's enough messing about with it. While it all kind of works, it's going to be a lot better with hobby grade electronics. So we've got a 3-channel FlySky receiver and a high-tech HS65MG servo. A cheaper one will work fine too. Metal gears would be good, but I had this one spare from another project and I think it's going to be an ideal fit. We're also going to need an ESC, but that hasn't arrived yet. Before we take the truck apart, we'll need the battery out. Now I think I'm going to be replacing it with a 2-cell LiPo if we can find one that fits. I'm hoping a 1 amp hour will, but it's more likely going to be a 800 milliamp hour to fit in the tray. The cab's held on with 4 screws. There's 2 at the front that attach the bumper to the chassis. The screws come out and then the bumper just slides off. At the back of the cab there's tabs that sit on the chassis rails. All we do is remove the screws and the cab can be hinged forward, being very careful of the headlight wiring. Then we've got the battery tray. It's held on with 2 more screws. And now we can get to the PCB, which is held on with yet another screw. Surprisingly, all the bits are connected to the PCB with some proper connectors. All we need to do is unplug them. Of course, they didn't go as far as marking which connectors do what on the PCB, but we're not going to be reusing it anyway, so it really doesn't matter a lot to us. The interior of the cab is held on with 2 screws that also hold the hinge together. That's going to make it really easy to remove when we come to paint. Next out is the steering system. The 2 white centering arms are held on with a couple of screws. They come out and after a bit of a fight the arms should just lift away. The steering gearbox has 2 more screws that need to come out, and there's a screw in the end of the arm that attaches to the steering rod. Now the gearbox should just lift out, leaving us with an almost bare mounting area for the hobby grade bits. There's just 2 more screws to take out to remove the power switch. Well, there we go then, one artfully posed stripped chassis. We could remove the bed too, and we will when we do the paint, but for now it doesn't really get in the way, so it can just stay put. We could use the linkage that comes with the truck, but it's really sloppy. It's going to be better to replace it with a couple of proper ball ends. Now this is an old pair from Sleck here in the UK. They're designed for 8BA screws, but M2 is going to be close enough. The stock linkage is held on with yet another of those little self-tappers. There's quite a bit of slop between the drag link and the hubs. It looks pretty bad, but if you compare it with a lot of the stock Tamiya's, it's really not that much worse. The steering servo is going to sit somewhere up on the electronics tray. We're going to have to clear off some plastic, but first we need to clip 3 of the arms from the servo arm and fit one of the ball ends. The servo did come with a nice, slightly longer single servo arm, but I've long since lost track of the packet, and the little HS65s don't use the same splines as the bigger high-tech servos. I've got a replacement pack on the way, but I think we might just get away with a modified crossarm. After clipping the unwanted arms off, I've given it a quick buzz with the Dremel to smooth out the remains of the nubs. You don't really need to, but if anything gets stuck up near the servo, it's less likely to get hung up. So we can fit the ball end, we'll need to drill out the hole for an M2 screw. I'm using a 1.9mm bit, so the M2 screw will have just a little bit to bite into, making it easier to assemble. And it's worth noting you really shouldn't use your finger as a backstop. Now we can fit the ball end with a screw. This one's sourced from the extra bits from some Tamiya kit. To make sure it's not going to go anywhere, I fitted an M2 nylock nut on the back. There's no point in doing this assembly up super tight, we only need to just nip it up. Over tightening it will only press the ball into the nylon, causing the ball end to bind. On the hub there's a small pillar that sits inside the stock linkage. We'll need to cut that flush for the ball end. So we don't cut into the tyre, we'll need to remove the wheel too. It's attached with another of the small self-tappers. It's fairly tight, so you have to be a bit careful you don't slip. The wheel then just slides off, revealing a nice little hex drive. A quick trim with the Dremel is all it takes. The plastic seems to cut very nicely with a rotary tool. As long as you don't build up too much heat, it's easy to get a nice straight edge. So we can mount the ball end, we need to take the screw from the bottom of the arm too, and drill a hole all the way through with a 2mm bit. The stock hole isn't far off 2mm already, so this is to clear any bits of moulding flash as much as anything. Now we can pop in a long M2 screw with a washer under the head through the arm. Slide on a ball end and cap it off with another M2 nylock nut. Again, we don't need to do it up all that tight, just lightly nipped up. We can slide the wheel back on now, so we've got a nice stable chassis to work on, but we won't bother refitting the screw yet, as the ball end's probably going to have to come off again before we're done. There's a bit of trial and error next. The servo wants to sit so the ball ends are in line. The trick is to line up the servo and see what gets in the way, then attack the plastic with a Dremel until it all fits. I've taken quite a bit of plastic away, but there's still plenty left to keep the strength for the chassis. I ended up setting it up so the servo output is on the far side to the other ball end. They were a bit too close together otherwise. I think we would have struggled to get the linkage in under the leaf spring. Before we go any further, we need to hook up the servo to a servo tester or radio and centre up the arm. Now through a degree of luck, the arm seems to be centred already, so we can do a quick clearance check with the arm at full deflection. We need to make sure it can go end to end without binding, and that the ball end is free to move too. Linkage next. The easiest thing to do is use some model aircraft push rods with the end pre-threaded. These are designed to go between wing-mounted servos and ailerons, but they're going to work a treat here too. The threaded end needs to be threaded into the servo's ball end, making sure there's a good amount threaded in, but still with a bit of space at the end just in case we need to adjust it later. So the ball ends are at the right angles, we need to bend the rod just after the threaded portion. We want the ball end on the steering arm to run parallel with the drag link when the steering's centred. It's probably going to need another little tweak later, but it'll be close enough for now. Next we can mark up where the end of the rod comes on the ball end so we can cut it to length. We want it to be just a fraction shorter than the maximum length we could fit in. And while we're cutting, we also need to score up the end of the rod too. like so. It's going to end up being glued in, but right now the hole in the ball end is sized to take the thread, so we need to drill it out to 2mm so the rod is a sliding fit. You have to be a bit careful here not to overshoot with the drill bit. We only want to open up the existing hole, not extend the depth. Before we go near it with the glue, we need to do a final test fit, placing the servo in position and putting the linkage together. We need to have a good look around, making sure nothing's going to cause problems, and check to make sure the ball ends are nicely aligned. I think we're good to go here. So it's out with a hot snot to glue in the servo. The usual caution applies. If you live somewhere with really hot weather, hot glue will probably fail. Here in the UK, you'd have to leave the truck in a parked car on the hottest day of summer to really have a problem. As long as the servo and the mount are nice and clean, it's going to hold just fine. Let it completely cool and we can move on to the ball end. We're going to need fast access to the part, so the wheel needs to come off again, along with the ball end. We're going to use some 5-minute epoxy, so we need to be fairly quick getting it all put together. Mix up a fresh batch. We don't need a lot, but it's better to mix up slightly too much than not enough. With a cocktail stick, put a little bit of epoxy in the hole in the end of the ball end. It'll take a few transfers a little bit at a time to get enough in there. Slide the push rod in and work it in and out a few times to get all the trapped air out. If it feels like it's trying to push itself out, keep working it. When there's no air left, it will be difficult to pull the rod back out. Now, while still being fairly quick, we can refit the ball end to the hub with its nut. Slide the wheel back on and sit the chassis on its wheels with the steering set nice and straight. Leave it for a good hour or so to fully harden and we can start fitting the radio. Completely by luck, the 3-channel FlySky receiver fits perfectly between the servo and rear lip of the mounting plate. There's a little nub sticking up though, but a quick pass with the Dremel will soon have that fixed. There we go. What would we do without those little rotary tools? You'd almost think that that was done on purpose. It's such a good fit. Right, under where the radio's going, there's a nice little pocket that will work to keep the servo wire tidy and out of the way. We'll concertina up the wire so it doesn't try and escape. Now usually I'd use a zip tie to keep it together, but there's not quite enough space, so this time I'm going to use a bit of electrical tape. Not quite as nice, but it'll do the job. To stick the radio down, we need a couple of thin strips of servo tape. It only makes contact on the ends, so we don't need to cover the whole radio. Remove the backing, stick the radio down, and plug in the servo. We'll have to come up with something clever for the antenna to keep it out of harm's way, but other than that I think it looks pretty neat. The final test is whether it all fits under that battery tray. The top of the servo plug is right up to the height of the mounting post, so it's going to be close. Looks like the locating bits on the tray are going to add a little bit of clearance too, so we might get away with it. Well, would you look at that? It fits! It's always a bit of a risk if you don't measure everything, but sometimes I like living on the edge. We just need to set up the transmitter now and we've got some proper steering. Before we power the truck up, we need to set the endpoints on the transmitter, turning them right down so we can't accidentally overrun the mechanics. Just setting them to something nicely under 50% usually does the job. Since we don't have an ESC with its BEC yet, we'll just use a 4-cell receiver pack to power things. As soon as we plug it in, the system's active. Right now we've got very little steering, as you'd expect. We can flip the chassis over, hold the steering wheel at full lock and increase the endpoint until we have it set where things aren't quite binding. Turn the wheel to the other lock and repeat. Turns out we're right up to the maximum 120% endpoint at both ends, but it's so close to the maximum the linkages will handle, I think we're just going to leave it. We could swap out to a longer arm if they ever turn up, but we'll only gain a degree or so of lock, so it's probably not worth it. I think there should be just enough space to fit an ESC under the cab. There's a nice recess right in the middle that might just be big enough. For now though, the best we can do is just push the chassis back and forth while fiddling about with the steering. And the steering does seem to work pretty well. So, until the postman comes with a new ESC, which was supposed to be coming from Liverpool, but I think they really meant Shenzhen, so it might take a week or two, that's about it. I know it's only a toy grade truck, but it's a lot of fun to tinker with, so I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, do please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you've got something to say. Thanks for watching, bye guys!